Hello, Ms. Perlez. Welcome to this episode of Today on Wall Street. We're so great to have you here today with us. And many of our audience already know you or your Chinese name,裴若思, more commonly. And we know you were the bureau chief in Beijing for New York Times. You were a Pulitzer Prize winner. But before we get started, can you first tell us a little bit about your personal journey as a journalist covering China? How did it all start? And what aspect of China interested you the most?
Well, Lizzie, it's very nice to be here with you. Goes back quite a way for my personal journey, and it was quite serendipity, I guess. I grew up in Australia, and in the late 60s, the universities in Australia tried something that was quite adventurous in those days. They offered student trips to 3 countries, India, Indonesia, or China. And I thought Indonesia was too close to Australia, and I thought India was probably too much disease, and China was by far the most interesting. So 67 of us got on a boat. We went steerage class to Hong Kong, and we got into mainland China in early 1967 at the height of the Cultural Revolution. So we had a really amazing experience. We were guided by guides, very experienced guides, I'll tell you a little bit about that later, from the National Travel Service. They spoke perfect English. It turned out that, and he was military intelligence, had been assigned for a bit of a break, I guess, to guide us for 3 weeks. But I think he found it quite stressful, because he also told me when I met him much later that they had no idea what was going on in the Cultural Revolution, and they had to sort of parrot all this stuff, not having a clue what was going to come next. But obviously it was a very fascinating trip to see China, such a large country, convulsed by such political turmoil directed by one man. That was a really very big lesson. And we met Cheng Yi, the foreign minister, in the Great Hall of the People. And it was very striking to us at the time that the foreign minister had nothing better to do than to entertain Australian university students in the freezing halls of the Great Hall of the People. So it was a landmark journey, I think, for many of us. And I did not want to become a China specialist per se. I wanted to become a foreign correspondent, but I was always fascinated by China, and luckily had a chance to follow up.
I see. So speaking of one really extraordinary aspect of your career covering China, is sort of the timeline. So you started covering China for New York Times in 2012, which coincided with the year Xi Jinping came to power as China's paramount leader. And I remember listening to one podcast episode you hosted where you sort of narrated the time when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had a formal lunch party for then Vice President Xi Jinping of China. So at that time, Xi Jinping was a vice president, but people knew he was going to be the leader for China. So what was your first impression of Xi at that time?
Well, I think I should say that perhaps my impression isn't so important as the impression of the people in the room at that lunch. I was there. I was just about to go out to China, and the State Department was really very kind and gave me a front table. And before the formalities started, I was circulating around the room, and I was just struck by how these allegedly hard-bitten American policymakers. I remember Bob Zoellick was there, and he just seemed to be over the moon about Xi Jinping. I thought this was really quite odd, or quite amazing. Yang Jiechi was there from the Chinese side, Henry Kissinger was there, so all the big stars of the China-US relationship was there. And it was held on Valentine's Day. So I don't know whether that added to the euphoria, but it was just so striking that people who had handled China policy from the American side were very confident that this man was going to be good for the United States. And I think it's just because they thought business would continue as usual, and they had no idea what was coming down the pike.
Right. And speaking of sort of misjudgment about Xi Jinping, Nick Kristof, one of my favorite writers, once wrote a glowing column about Xi Jinping back in 2013, calling Xi Jinping sort of the reformer for China, and predicting that Xi Jinping will spearhead a resurgence of economic and political reform. But apparently, Nick Kristof was not the only one who was wrong here. And as you said, U.S. diplomats, U.S. officials, even seasoned China hands in the administration later admitted that they had misjudged Xi Jinping. So, how or why did we all get Xi Jinping so wrong? Was it Xi Jinping the one who changed, or what was the reason? How could we have this sort of collective mistake?
I think there are a couple of things. I think that American policymakers or Americans who had dealt with China were impressed by the fact that Xi's father had been part of Deng Xiaoping's opening up in the South. I think that they didn't know, honestly, they didn't know that much about Xi Jinping. They knew that he'd been vice president, and they knew that he had gone out of his way to travel the world in those years that he was vice president, but they didn't know that much about him. So I think they wanted to believe what they wanted to believe, and they wanted to believe that this man would be good for American-Chinese commercial relations. I don't think the military, it seems to me, did not assess what was clearly obvious, Xi's ambition for China around the world and as a global power. China had reached economic power, and the next thing was political and global power. So it's a little hard to. I think the other thing, which is very important, Lizzie, I think the United States had been distracted for too long by the Middle East. Distracted by 9/11, distracted by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The China experts really didn't get enough of a look in. I don't think they realized how cocky China felt after 2008. They were not affected by 2008 in the way the United States was. So it was a colossal misjudgment. Now, whether the United States would have acted differently during the Obama years, had they assessed Xi correctly, I'm not so sure, because I think in the Obama years, Washington was also distracted still by Afghanistan and by Iraq and the Middle East. And they just sort of let China slide. I think it was in part because Obama himself did not have a lot of background on China. His national security advisor didn't have a lot of background. Susan Rice didn't have a lot of background on China. There were not big China hands. And same for the military.
I see. So speaking of sort of different U.S. presidents and their attitude toward China, when we talk about the Trump administration, there are many things people complain about the administration. They have no strategy. Things are all over the place, infighting, whatever. But one thing that sort of stood out, among many of the chaos during that administration seems to be this new attitude toward China. Would you give the Trump administration credit for finally standing up against China? Do you think that's a fair assessment of the administration?
I don't really give them much credit for quote unquote, standing up to China. I think it was a kind of heavy-handed effort without a lot of depth. I think people who knew about China in the United States were kept out of the deliberations. I think it was a kind of mindless, let's get the Reds kind of policy. So I wouldn't give them a lot of credit. I mean, yes, they did take a quote unquote tougher line, but they, at the same time, they ignored the allies in Asia, pretty much. They did not bring the allies along, and that's very, very important. And now that makes it very difficult, I think, for the Biden administration. I think it'll be difficult to bring along the allies in Asia and other countries in Asia that are not necessarily formal allies, but are friendly with the United States. I think it's just gone too far, and China's economic power is so overwhelming that it's a lot to ask countries in Asia to just, you can't ask them to just sink their economic interests with China. Not possible.
And, when people talk about the difference between the Biden administration's China policy versus the Trump administration's China policy, I think most are struck by how similar they are, at least, the rhetoric, right? So the Biden administration describes China as the most serious rival in his own words. and also continued many of the policies the Trump administration initiated, right? Sanctions toward Xinjiang, sanctions toward Hong Kong, and things like that, and even on the trade war front. Do you see that continuation, or do you think there's going to be a break from the Trump administration's China policy toward more normalization?
Oh, I don't think there'll be normalization. I think that they will continue, as the trade representative had said, they'll continue the tariffs. I mean, hopefully they will, and they have very smart people at the top, they will choose their spots and make clear that they are not going to be rolled on cyber, which is of paramount importance. And they're not going to be rolled on the South China Sea, which is also of paramount importance. But I don't like to say that the Biden administration is similar to the Trump administration. I think that hopefully there'll be more thought and clarity and hopefully more effort to bring the allies along, as difficult as it might be.
I see.
But, I think for too long, the United States ignored what China was doing. I mean, one of the first things I did when I was in China in 2013 was to go to Astana, where Xi Jinping made the announcement of the Belt and Road initiative. And it was quite fascinating being there at the university, listening to the leader of China, describe how China was going to reach out to the world and build infrastructure in many places that the United States had the opportunity to do, had the opportunity to do for decades before, but had neglected to do. And I think that Xi was very smart to choose to take the initiative on that. Similarly with the AIIB, I covered that from the very beginning and watched how the Obama administration was just shock horror that China should launch an international bank and told its allies, South Korea and Australia, not to join. So clumsy. And both countries did join. So Xi was very clever, I think, in catching the United States flat-footed back then. I don't think that the United States is going to be caught quite so flat-footed from now on, but I think that there needs to be closer attention, even closer attention than there is now, because now there's the risk that Washington will turn inwards rather than keep its eye out on the Asia-Pacific region and China itself. I just hope they send a very strong team to the embassy in Beijing.
I see. So, speaking of this sort of strongman tendency of Xi Jinping and his view of the world, there was this really interesting op-ed piece written by you in the New York Times, which was about Chen Xiaolu. And, during an interview with you, Chen Xiaolu noted that the Chinese leadership saw the U.S. in decline, and he predicted the trend was for the two countries to grow apart, which turned out to be a very accurate prediction, and that was not even in recent years. So, looking back at that interview, what signs about Xi Jinping and his administration did Chen Xiaolu notice that was worrisome to him?
Well, I think Chen Xiaolu was a very extraordinary person. As I mentioned, I met his father, Chen Yi, the foreign minister, many years ago, and that's how I first came to know Chen Xiaolu. And we have to remember that Chen Xiaolu was a member of the princeling class, so he had inside contacts, friends, information on what the thinking was in the inner circles of the Xi Jinping camp. And I think that Chen Xiaolu was able to see very early. He said to me, this anti-corruption drive by Xi Jinping, well, it's all very well and good, but actually it's a political purge. And because it's a political purge, the bureaucracy is very scared and the bureaucracy is not working very well. And I think he was concerned that private enterprise was going to be curbed a lot because Xi Jinping favored state-run industries and state-run enterprises. So from his inside view, he was able to draw very fast and correct conclusions. And I was always very, well, in a way, honored to go and have lunch with him from time to time. When, by the way, we would meet in an Italian restaurant and Xiaolu would always order the same spaghetti and the same ice cream.
What's his favorite spaghetti, type of spaghetti he always ordered?
I think it was a spaghetti with a tomato-based
sauce. Yeah, I see. Interesting. And what's his favorite ice cream flavor?
That I don't remember, I have to say, but I think sort of 3 scoops arrived in a big bowl.
I see.
Yes. But he was a modest eater. Don't get me wrong. He was a modest eater.
I see.
He was very charming.
Yeah, so interesting. And, it's interesting how, insider, so to speak, can sort of be more clear-eyed about the administration than the outsiders and, outside observers. But,
Yes.
Sort of looking ahead a little bit, I think the million-dollar question here is, how is this going to all end? We know Xi Jinping has eliminated rivals, cowed the system, and demolished the power-sharing norms that evolved since Deng Xiaoping. Looking back in the United States, a mature democracy with robust legal procedures, sometimes peaceful succession is not always guaranteed, as we saw in this, in the last election cycles. So what do you think will happen to leadership succession in PRC? Based on your observations and your conversations with other experts, do we expect Xi Jinping to remain in power until he can no longer perform the duties of the office, so to speak?
Well, as you said, it is the million-dollar question, and I have to say I'm not an expert on elite politics in China. There are many people who spend their waking hours and non-waking hours researching and thinking about this. I guess one of the questions we all have to ask is what's going on with Wang Qishan. His right-hand person has just been arrested, and Wang Qishan knows a lot about Xi Jinping. Would he have the power and the guts to organize something against Xi Jinping? I'm not an expert. I have no idea. Personally, I would guess kind of doubtful. I think it's impossible to say what's going to happen, but I think it is possible to see the obvious, that the outward grip of Xi Jinping is getting tighter and tighter. I noticed in the press, I had to laugh the other day. I don't know if you noticed, but there was a big prominent headline in one of the Chinese, some Xinhua headline. It said, Tai Chi contest in Malta. Malta. I don't know if Malta may have one vote at the UN. It's got to be the smallest speck in the world, right? And Xinhua doesn't have any other news to report except something that's happening about Tai Chi in Malta. It reminded me of the bad old days of the Cultural Revolution, when you would see sort of inane headlines about nothing to do with anything of importance. And so you have to wonder, why is this? Why isn't there any real news? There is real news, of course, that we read about Jack Ma, we read about what's going on with the big cyber companies. But you have to wonder and have to ask how much tighter Xi Jinping and his people can turn the screws down and down and down and down, because there does seem to be a lot of dissatisfaction among the princelings and among the elite. But does that add up to something against Xi Jinping? I doubt it.
I see. So speaking of sort of the relationship between censorship and control versus public opinion, many commentators and observers notice there seems to be a more nationalistic turn in public opinion among the Chinese. I wonder if that's a trend that you notice when covering China. Did you notice the public opinion seems to be more pro-party, throughout the years when you were covering China?
I'd say I left in 2019. I'd say after Xi announced his chairmanship of the party in the country forever, to use it loosely, I would say yes. Became much more difficult to report, became much more difficult to get people to speak honestly. I saw less and less of Chen Xiaolu, for example. I mean, I just didn't feel it was fair for him to ask him to, for us to see each other. It became very difficult. And of course, by then, the situation in Xinjiang had become an international concern. I never went to Xinjiang as a reporter because I'm not a Chinese speaker, and I felt very strongly that reporters who are Chinese speakers should go because you can pick up so much more. And also I didn't want to get one of our interpreters in the slightest bit of trouble. So I covered Xinjiang by going to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and by looking at the situation at the United Nations, where I found to my astonishment that big Arab countries and Muslim countries around the world were not expressing any opposition at all. And it made me realize how astute and clever and hardworking the Chinese have been in getting their point of view supported at the United Nations and other places. And I think that, the United States was somewhat asleep at the wheel, as I said, in the last couple of decades. And it took a long while to pick up on the advantages that China was gaining through hard work and diplomacy.
I see. And, from your description, it seems really important to have real firsthand good reporting on China so the outside world can see what's actually going on. And that's actually what the New York Times have been doing for many years, including your own work. So, many of our audience are fans of New York Times coverage on China. But as you know, since the US-China relations were soured in the last few years, and I think it's sad and unfortunate that both countries have resorted to expelling journalists and restricting visas. And nowadays, covering China from within is just getting harder. And when journalists are able to do so, they face harassment and sometimes even grave personal dangers, as we saw in the case of Hayes Fan from Bloomberg. So, just for our audience, can you please tell us a little bit about what it's actually like for foreign journalists to cover China on the ground from within? And what are the common hurdles you have to jump through in order to get your story?
I mean, now it's become virtually impossible. I mean, for example, the BBC had a wonderful, absolutely amazing reporter, John Sudworth, who did some very brave reporting in Xinjiang, and he had to leave about 6 weeks ago because the harassment by the security forces was becoming so severe against him and his family, and he had to move to Taiwan. And we have New York Times has one reporter left in China, Keith Bradshaw, who covers business, which from the Chinese point of view is not so contentious. So Keith does valuable reporting on Chinese corporate business. And we have reporters now in Taiwan who call into China and have their contacts in China, but it makes it very, very difficult. And it becomes kind of, it lacks the reporting, I think, lacks the texture that you have by actually being in the place. And I think it's very detrimental from the Chinese point of view. I'm sort of surprised that they don't understand. On the one hand, I understand perfectly what they're doing. On the other hand, I think if they understood that by expelling everybody, they are creating more of a skepticism and doubts about China than if they just left us inside China and chose to deal with us there. I mean, this idea that contemporary American reporters are going to be like Edgar Snow was in the 1930s when he visited Yan'an and became friends with Mao is just, I mean, I'm sorry, it's just out to lunch. It's ridiculous. And I think the Chinese wolf warriors, for what you want, need to step back a bit and see that there are reporters. Western reporters don't want to ruin China. They don't have a political axe to grind. They want to be there to see the progress and the development and the moves backwards and forwards and what goes on inside the most populous, second richest country in the world, which is soon perhaps going to become the richest. I think they're missing out a lot by not allowing us to be there. I was very disappointed when I left. I knew someone quite well in the government, and this official invited me to lunch just before I left. And I thought it would be a nice, 1 hour, 90-minute discussion about our times, when we had seen each other and talk a bit about policy. But instead, I got a 3-hour lecture about how the United States was responsible for the turmoil in Hong Kong. And I just thought, this is so clumsy. It's so unnecessary. You don't really need to do this. So hope springs eternal. Maybe there'll be some softening, but I kind of doubt it.
So speaking of your own sort of career plans, do you plan to return to China in the near future? And, if no, why is that? If yes, why is that?
Well, I don't think it's on the cards that I can return to China. I mean, no New York Times person is going to be allowed back into China. I don't think in the next year or so. I am preparing a podcast and long article on the opening by Nixon and Kissinger to China in 1972. And I think that's a fascinating history, and and some of the aftermath as well. And we've discovered some new material, and I think it's very important that audiences in the United States and around the world and in China understand why that relationship developed. It was a hard-headed geopolitical decision by Nixon to befriend China so there could be a balance of power with the United States and China on one side against the Soviet Union. Now that seems to be changed and turned on its head. So there are some very interesting questions to ask now. Was it the right thing to open to China in 72? And should there have been some breaks on the relationship along the way? But maybe everybody, on both sides, were just very happy with what was going on, because after all, both sides were getting rich. And I think that was the dominant theme, and we'll see where it leads. Just hope there's not conflict in South China Sea or cyber conflict or any other kind of conflict, which could happen if there's not smart diplomats and a smart connection between the top leadership. I think it's helpful that Biden and Xi Jinping do know each other a little bit. They're not exactly foreigners to each other. Helpful that Biden and Xi Jinping spent some time together in 2011 in China when they were both vice presidents. I wouldn't overestimate it. I wouldn't say that this is going to solve anything, but I think it gives perhaps a better footing than what we had under Obama, who didn't know China, and Hu Jintao, who didn't seem that interested. So I think, in some respects, we may be fortunate in having these two leaders at a difficult time.
Let's hope for the best, and we are so excited to be able to see the article you just mentioned when it come out. So please make sure to tell us when it's out so we can take a look.
Yes.
Yeah, and also speaking of your more recent work, there's a new book, The Beijing Bureau, which just got published fresh off the press. Can you please tell us a little bit about the book? We'll also put a link to the book so our interested readers can take a look.
Yes, I mean, I have really nothing to do with this. It's a book, a collection of essays put together by an Australian publisher of work that was commissioned by the publisher for Australian correspondents, or correspondents who'd been born in Australia, basically, because I'm not really an Australian correspondent, but correspondents who'd been to China and covered China, who either grew up in Australia or had some link to Australia. So that's why my piece is included, and I chose to call my piece Father and Son, and it's about Chen Yi, the foreign minister, and Chen Xiaolu, his son, who we talked about, and how both were really loyal members of the Communist Party, but at the end of their lives, the Communist Party turned on them. And it was a very poignant illustration to me, I think, that so often and tragically, the party wins at all costs.
Right. So we'll also include a link to the op-ed in New York Times. So many of our audience who are interested in Chen Xiaolu and his life story can take a look. But thank you so much for all your insights. It's been such a great conversation. We'll also make sure to let our audience know when the new article you just mentioned come out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lizzie. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the good questions.
This was fun. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
裴若思父与子选段。小鲁不同于其他所谓的太子党中共元老的子女，他很随和，平易近人，愿意与外界对话，甚至能坦率地表达对当时新上任习近平领导下党的高层正在发生的事情的想法。我们通常在一家意大利餐厅见面，他每次都点同一种意大利面，然后是冰淇淋。他的英语还可以，许多年前他曾在中国驻英国大使馆做过武官。那时他是安邦的一位高层管理人员，这是一家发展迅速的保险集团，后来业务遍及多个领域。高管这个词可能太过强势，他看上去更像是一个可以帮助疏通关系的人，有着广泛的人脉，而不是一个精于商业的人。他不像北京的商务人士那样穿定制西装、锃亮的鞋子，留着精心修剪的发型。他赴约吃午餐时，往往穿的是休闲衬衫，留着灰白的寸头，背着一个过时的单肩布包。在我们头几次一起吃午餐时，小鲁比较小心谨慎，但是我可以感觉到他对习近平有所保留。小时候，他们都住在天安门广场边上同一个精英大院中南海，他们的父亲都是毛泽东时代大名鼎鼎的元老。小鲁暗示，习近平的第一个重大举措，在党内官员中开展全面的反腐运动，实际上是政治清洗。这让官员们对做决定感到恐惧，官僚们也彼此害怕。他还对9号文件发表了负面评论。9号文件是习近平上台后不久发布的，列出了中共定义为中国不可接受的西方思想，包括宪政民主、普世人权。9号文件是习近平发出的自由派人士将面临暴风骤雨的早期信号，它显示了习近平执行威权统治的决心。小鲁似乎深感失望。我们见面不久后，他做了一些非同寻常的事情，他为在文革中身为高中生的他犯下的错误而公开道歉。2013年8月，他在高中校友会的博客网站上发表了一篇文章，承认自己当红卫兵时犯的错误。他对校领导和一些老师、同学被劳改负有责任。后来他告诉我，他表达悔意是要传达一个教训：中国人民必须承认法治。他对我说，文化大革命中发生了许多侵犯人民权利的事情，在中国大多数人并没有真正经历过文化大革命，而我们经历过的人必须向人们讲述这件事。但是小鲁在救赎的道路上很孤单，周围很少有人支持他，社交媒体保持沉默。直到今天，文革时期的暴力肇事者仍未受到惩罚。在习近平为2015年首次正式访问华盛顿，参加巴拉克·奥巴马总统在白宫举行的国宴做准备的时候，我再次询问了小鲁。在那时，习近平正在大步迈向成为一个雄心勃勃的统治者，为他自己也为这个国家。实际上，他对自己的目标毫不隐晦。奥巴马政府似乎不大可能理解习近平的野心有多大，就算理解了，他们也决定不对此做任何事情。小鲁在习近平起飞前飞往美国的1周前，在午餐中告诉我的许多事情，后来完全按照他的描述那样发生了。小鲁说，中国现在有足够的能力来照顾自己在世界范围内的利益，美国会怎么做？他问道，并预言奥巴马政府不会给出多少答案。内在的信息是，中国领导人看到了美国的衰落。他指出，反西方情绪在中国媒体中无处不在，中国和美国的趋势是分崩离析，而习近平没有采取任何措施来改变这一状况。他说，俄罗斯和中国之间的关系越来越近，也许中国会在俄罗斯北部建立基地，我们可以从那里飞往美国附近。他说，不久的将来，中俄之间将建立默契联盟。甜点上来了，小鲁说，长期趋势很明显。 在每件事上，美国和中国都采取不同的政策，关系变得越来越紧张。这并不是我乐见的，但我无能为力。随着华盛顿和北京之间的紧张局势加剧，我越来越少见到小鲁了。我知道，对于他这种级别的人，被见到和西方记者在非正式场合见面是有些麻烦的，而且与他有关联的公司安邦变成了烫手山芋。安邦最初是一家保险集团，后来发展成为一家拥有各种业务的控股公司，包括美国地标地产。小鲁坚称自己不是安邦公司的高管，他只是个顾问。他的一位朋友告诉我，小鲁没有接受过业务培训，他没有参与安邦的运营。朋友说他是公司的军师。但是小鲁享受公司便利的方式很明显，他很爱讲述他的异国旅行，在非洲西海岸巡游、南极之旅、参观苏格兰的高尔夫球场。我们在最后一次午餐中开玩笑说，他将能够在安邦收购的纽约市地标酒店华尔道夫酒店里找到一个上好的房间。2017年开始，安邦和小鲁的情况开始恶化。公司董事长吴晓辉，妻子是中国后毛泽东时代强大领导人邓小平的孙女，被政府调查，他本人也被公司解雇。2018年，他被判18年有期徒刑。同年3月，小鲁去世了，具体情况不明。朋友们说，随着安邦受到政府实际上是共产党高层的调查，小鲁在上海被软禁。几个月后，他被允许离开寒冷的上海，在温暖的海南岛上短暂停留。在那里，他心脏病发作了，当地医院没能成功施救。朋友说，71岁的他直到前1年一直身体健康，他们认为对安邦进行的调查压力害了他。他的去世以某种方式汇聚了中国近代历史上2个截然不同但不可分割的部分，我对此深知已久。其先进的征服世界的赚钱野心，嫁接在共产党不可改变的根茎上。